You have never touched anything. Not once. Not ever. In your entire life, every handshake, every embrace, every moment you held your child or pressed your lips to someone you loved, you never made contact. Your fingers and the surface you thought you were touching never met. They came close, astonishingly close, within nanometers, but they never touched. What you felt, what your brain interpreted as the sensation of contact, of pressure, of solidity, was the electromagnetic repulsion between the electron clouds of your atoms and the electron clouds of the atoms in the surface. Your electrons pushed against their electrons. The electrons never touched either. They repelled each other through the electromagnetic force, across a gap that never closed. The sensation of touch is your brain's interpretation of a force field. The solidity is a construction. The contact is an illusion. You have spent your entire life reaching for a world that you have never, in any physical sense, reached. This is not a philosophical thought experiment. It is physics, the physics of atomic structure, known since the early 20th century, confirmed by every experiment in quantum mechanics, and taught in every introductory physics course on the planet. And yet its implications are so disturbing that most people, upon learning it, immediately forget it, retreating to the comfortable assumption that the desk under their hands is solid, the ground under their feet is firm, and the world they perceive is the world that exists. The assumption is wrong. The world you perceive is a construction built by your brain from sensory data that is itself a translation of something far stranger, far more abstract, and far less solid than anything your senses report. The atom, the building block of matter, the thing that everything you have ever seen or touched is made of, is almost entirely empty. If the nucleus of a hydrogen atom were the size of a basketball, the single electron orbiting it would be a grain of sand approximately 2 miles away. Everything in between the vast majority of the atom's volume is nothing. Empty space, not filled with some invisible substance, not occupied by some undetectable medium. Empty. The atom is a tiny speck of matter surrounded by an enormous void, and the void is what you are made of. You are, by volume, 99.999999999999996% empty space. The total amount of actual matter in your body, the quarks and electrons that have measurable mass, would fit in a cube smaller than a grain of sand. If you removed all the empty space from every atom in every human being on Earth, 8 billion people, compressed to the density of the atomic nucleus, the entire human race would fit inside a volume the size of a sugar cube. And the matter that remains, the quarks, the electrons, the tiny specks of substance within the void, is itself mysterious. Quarks are point particles. They have no measurable size, no volume, no spatial extension. They are mathematical points entities defined not by their substance but by their properties: charge, spin, color charge, mass. And mass itself, the property that makes matter feel substantial, that gives things weight, that makes the desk feel solid under your hands, is not intrinsic to the quarks. It is generated by the Higgs field, a quantum field that permeates all of space and that gives particles mass through their interaction with it. The mass is not in the quark. It is in the interaction between the quark and the field. Remove the Higgs field and the quark has no mass. The solidity that you experience, the weight, the heft, the resistance of physical objects, is produced by a field interaction, not by a substance. You are not made of stuff. You are made of interactions. And interactions are not material. They are informational patterns of relationship between entities that are themselves nothing more than bundles of properties. Everything else is force fields, electromagnetic interactions, and the mathematical rules that govern them. You are not a thing. You are a pattern of forces, a pattern of interactions, a pattern of information held in a configuration that your brain interprets as a body. The color you see is not in the world. It is in your brain. The light that enters your eyes is electromagnetic radiation waves oscillating at specific frequencies. The frequency is real. The color is not. Red does not exist outside your visual cortex. What exists is a photon oscillating at approximately 430 terahertz. Your retina converts the frequency to a neural signal. Your visual cortex converts the neural signal to the subjective experience of redness. The redness is your brain's label for a frequency. Other animals with different visual systems label the same frequency differently or do not perceive it at all. Bees see ultraviolet, mantis shrimp see 16 color channels where you see 3. The color is not in the photon, the color is in the processing, and the processing is in the brain. The sound you hear is not in the world. What exists is pressure, variations in the air, compressions and rarefactions of gas molecules traveling at approximately 340 meters per second. Your tympanic membrane vibrates. Your cochlea converts the vibration to neural signals. Your auditory cortex converts the neural signals to the subjective experience of sound, pitch, timbre, volume, the voice of someone you love, the melody of a song that makes you cry. The voice is not in the air. The melody is not in the pressure waves. They are in the auditory cortex constructions, interpretations, translations of a physical phenomenon that is, in itself, silent. The universe makes no sound. Pressure waves propagate. And the brain, interpreting the propagation, creates the symphony. The warmth you feel is not in the object. What exists is the kinetic energy of molecules, their velocity, their vibration, their collisions with each other and with the molecules of your skin. Faster molecules produce the sensation of heat. Slower molecules produce the sensation of cold, but heat and cold are not properties of the objects. They are your brain's interpretation of molecular kinetic energy, an interpretation so effective and so automatic that you cannot distinguish the interpretation from the reality. The hot coffee feels hot, but the hotness is in your somatosensory cortex, not in the coffee. The coffee has kinetic energy. Your brain has the experience of heat, and the two are not the same thing. The smell you perceive is not in the flower. What exists is a cloud of volatile molecules, chemical compounds that have evaporated from the flower's surface and drifted through the air to your nose. The molecules bind to olfactory receptors in your nasal epithelium. The receptors send electrical signals to the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb sends signals to the piriform cortex and the amygdala. And somewhere in this chain of electrochemical transduction, the experience of fragrance appears, the sweetness of jasmine, the sharpness of pine, the warmth of cinnamon. The fragrance is not in the molecules. The molecules are shapes, three-dimensional configurations of atoms that fit into receptor proteins like keys into locks. The fragrance is the brain's interpretation of the key's shape. Change the receptor and the same molecule smells different. Remove the receptor and the molecule has no smell at all. The flower is not fragrant. The flower emits molecules. Your brain creates the fragrance. The taste you experience is not in the food. What exists is a set of chemical interactions between dissolved compounds and taste receptor cells on your tongue. 5 basic categories of interaction: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami that the brain combines with olfactory input, texture information, temperature data, and visual cues to construct the rich, multidimensional experience of flavor. A strawberry does not contain the experience of strawberry flavor. A strawberry contains sugars, acids, volatile esters, and anthocyanins. Your brain integrating taste, smell, texture, color, temperature, and memory constructs the experience of eating a strawberry. The experience is a masterpiece of neural construction. And the construction is so seamless, so automatic, so convincing that you cannot perceive the constructing. You perceive only the result. Donald Hoffman, a cognitive scientist at the University of California, Irvine has formalized this insight into what he calls the interface theory of perception. Hoffman argues that perception did not evolve to show you reality. Perception evolved to keep you alive. And the representations that keep you alive are not the representations that show you the truth. Natural selection favors fitness, not accuracy. The organism that perceives the world accurately but responds slowly loses to the organism that perceives a simplified, distorted, but actionable model and responds quickly. Evolution did not design your senses to be cameras that record reality. It designed them to be interfaces like the desktop of a computer, which shows you icons and folders that bear no resemblance to the electrical states of the transistors that actually process the information. The blue icon on your desktop is not blue. It is not an icon. It is not on a desktop. It is a pattern of voltage states in silicon transistors. But the icon is useful. It allows you to interact with the computer without understanding the transistors. Your perception is the same kind of interface. It allows you to interact with reality without perceiving reality. And the reality behind the interface, the reality that the icons represent but do not resemble, is, as we will see, informational. Everything you have ever experienced, every color, every sound, every taste, every smell, every texture, every temperature, every sensation of any kind, is a construction built by your brain. From data that is itself a translation of something that your brain cannot directly perceive, you do not experience reality. You experience your brain's model of reality. And the model, while useful, while adaptive, while spectacularly effective at keeping you alive and navigating the physical world, is not reality. It is a map. And the map is not the territory. This is not new. This recognition that the perceived world is a construction, that the senses do not reveal reality but interpret it, that the map is not the territory has appeared independently in every major intellectual tradition in human history. And the traditions arrived at it not through atomic physics but through sustained introspective investigation, through the systematic observation of perception itself, conducted over decades of contemplative practice, refined through generations of practitioners, and expressed in language that anticipates the physics by millennia. Plato described it in the 4th century BCE with the allegory of the cave. Prisoners chained in a cave see shadows on the wall, shadows cast by objects they cannot see, illuminated by a fire they cannot perceive. The prisoners take the shadows for reality. They name the shadows. They discuss the shadows. They build their entire understanding of the world from the shadows. And when one prisoner is freed and sees the objects that cast the shadows and then the fire, and then the sun outside the cave, the prisoner realizes that everything they had taken for reality was a projection, a shadow, an interpretation of something deeper that the cave's constraints had concealed. The Hindu tradition described it as Maya, the cosmic illusion that makes the formless appear as form, the infinite appear as finite, the one appear as many. Maya is not a lie. It is not a trick played on helpless victims by a malicious deity. It is the nature of perception itself, the inevitable consequence of experiencing the infinite through finite senses. The senses cannot perceive Brahman, the ultimate reality, the formless ground of all being, because the senses are designed to perceive form. They perceive color, sound, shape, texture. They do not perceive the formless. And so the formless appears, through the lens of the senses, as formed as the solid, colored, audible, tangible world of everyday experience. Maya is not the world being fake. Maya is the world being perceived through instruments that cannot show you what it really is. The Mandukya Upanishad makes this explicit by analyzing the states of consciousness. In waking, you perceive the external world through the senses and you take it for reality. In dreaming, you perceive an internal world through the mind, and while you dream, you take it for reality too. In deep sleep, you perceive nothing and yet you continue to exist, because when you wake you know that you slept. And in Turiya, the fourth state, the state that underlies the other three, you perceive what is real, the formless, luminous awareness that is present in all three states, but that is not identical to any of them. The waking world and the dream world have the same epistemological status. Both are constructions. Both are perceived through instruments that shape and limit perception. Both are mistaken for reality by the perceiver who is immersed in them. The only difference is that the dreamer wakes up from the dream. The tradition asks, what if waking up from the waking world is also possible? The Buddhist tradition expressed it through the concept of shunyata, emptiness, the absence of inherent existence in all phenomena. The Heart Sutra states it with devastating brevity. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Form is not other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than form. The desk is empty, not empty of function, not empty of appearance, not empty of the capacity to support your coffee cup, but empty of the inherent, independent, self-existing solidity that your senses attribute to it. The desk appears solid. It functions as solid. But its solidity is not its own. It is constructed by the interaction of your senses with a web of conditions that has no independent core. The desk is a process, not a thing. And the process, the web of quantum interactions, electromagnetic forces, and informational relationships that constitute the desk is, as we will see, far more fundamental than the apparent solidity that it produces. Nagarjuna, the 2nd century Buddhist philosopher who developed the Madhyamaka school, anticipated the information physics framework with extraordinary precision. Nagarjuna argued that nothing exists independently. Everything arises in dependence upon conditions, and the conditions themselves arise in dependence upon further conditions. In an infinite web of mutual dependence that has no foundation, no bedrock, no ultimate ground that exists independently of everything else. This is pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, the principle that nothing is self-existing, that everything is relational, that existence is not a property of things, but a property of relationships between things, and relationships are not material, they are informational. A relationship between two particles is not a third particle connecting them. It is an informational structure, a pattern of correlation, a set of constraints on the possible states of each particle given the state of the other. The entangled state of two particles is not a physical wire connecting them. It is an informational bond, a shared bit, a mutual constraint, a correlation that transcends spatial separation because information, unlike matter, is not confined to a specific location. A relationship is not a substance. It is a pattern of connection, of interaction, of mutual influence. If everything that exists is constituted by relationships, and if relationships are informational rather than material, then reality is, at its most fundamental level, informational, not material, not substantial, informational. And this is precisely what 21st century physics is discovering. John Archibald Wheeler, one of the most influential physicists of the 20th century, a figure whose contributions span the entire arc of modern physics, the man who coined the terms black hole, quantum foam, and wormhole, the colleague of Einstein and Bohr, the teacher of Feynman and Everett, proposed in 1989 what he called the it from bit doctrine. Every it, every particle, every field of force, Even the space-time continuum itself derives its function, its meaning, its very existence entirely from binary choices, bits, the answers to yes or no questions. Matter comes from information, not the other way around. The bit is more fundamental than the atom. The yes or no question is more fundamental than the particle. And the physical universe, the universe of matter, energy, space-time, and forces, is a secondary phenomenon, emerging from a more fundamental reality that is purely informational. Wheeler was not a mystic. He was not a philosopher, dabbling in physics. He was one of the architects of 20th century physics, a man who had worked on the Manhattan Project, who had collaborated with Bohr on nuclear fission theory, who had made fundamental contributions to general relativity and quantum gravity, and at the end of 5 decades spent studying the most fundamental constituents of reality, Wheeler arrived at a conclusion that startled the physics community. The most fundamental constituent is not a constituent at all. It is a bit, a piece of information, a yes or a no. Wheeler went further. He proposed the concept of the participatory universe, a universe that does not exist in a definite state until it is observed. The observer, the conscious agent who asks the question, who performs the measurement, who establishes the bit, is not a passive spectator of a pre-existing reality. The observer is a participant in the creation of reality. The question creates the answer. The measurement creates the property. The bit creates the it. And without the bit, without the information, without the observation, without the question being asked, the it does not exist. To exist is to be known. To be real is to be measured. And measurement is the creation of information. Wheeler did not arrive at this conclusion from philosophy. He arrived at it from physics specifically, from the implications of quantum mechanics. The double-slit experiment, the foundational experiment of quantum mechanics, demonstrates that the behavior of a particle is determined by what information is available about it. When no information exists about which slit the particle passes through, the particle behaves as a wave, producing an interference pattern on the detection screen. When information exists about which slit the particle passes through, the particle behaves as a particle, producing 2 bands on the detection screen. The information determines the reality, not the physical setup, not the forces, not the energy, the information. Add information and the wave becomes a particle. Remove information and the particle becomes a wave. The physical reality is a function of the informational state. The delayed choice version of the experiment makes this even more striking. In Wheeler's delayed choice experiment, the decision about whether to obtain which path information is made after the particle has already passed through the slits. The information that will exist in the future determines the behavior of the particle in the past. The particle's history is not fixed until the information about that history is established. Reality is not determined by what happened. It is determined by what is known by the informational state of the system. The universe does not have a fixed history that observation merely reveals. The universe has a history that observation creates through the establishment of information. The implications of the delayed choice experiment are staggering. They mean that the information state of the present determines the physical reality of the past. Time does not protect reality from information. The information reaches backward through time, through the experiment, through the space-time structure that we experience as a one-way flow from past to future, and determines what happened before the information existed. This is not an interpretation. It has been confirmed in the laboratory by Aspect, by Kim and Shi, by Ma and Zeilinger. The past is not fixed. It is information dependent. And information can be created, modified, and erased in the present, which means the past can be created, modified, and influenced by the present. This is the most radical finding in the history of physics, and it is the finding that transforms Wheeler's it from bit, from a philosophical slogan into a physical principle. If information determines reality even retroactively, even across time, then information is not a description of reality, it is reality. The bit is not about the it, the bit is the it. Anton Zeilinger, who shared the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics for experiments in quantum information science, extended Wheeler's insight into a comprehensive framework. The most fundamental concept in physics, Zeilinger argued, is not matter, it is not energy, it is information. The quantum state, the most complete description of a physical system that physics allows, is not a description of the system's properties. It is a description of the information that is available about the system. The properties emerge when the information is established through measurement, through interaction, through the physical process that converts quantum indeterminacy into classical definiteness. Before measurement, the system has no definite properties. After measurement, it does. The measurement creates the properties by creating the information. The properties are not prior to the information. The information is prior to the properties. Rolf Landauer, a physicist at IBM who spent decades studying the relationship between information and physics, crystallized this in his famous dictum: information is physical. Landauer demonstrated that erasing one bit of information, resetting a binary register from 1 to 0, or from 0 to 1, requires a minimum expenditure of energy, kT/ln2, where K is Boltzmann's constant and T is the temperature. This is not a technological limitation. It is a law of nature, as fundamental as the conservation of energy or the increase of entropy. Information is not an abstract concept that humans project onto the physical world. Information is a physical quantity, as real as mass, as measurable as charge, as conserved as energy. And the laws that govern information, the laws of its creation, its preservation, its transformation, and its destruction, are laws of physics. The Bekenstein-Hawking formula makes the connection between information and physics explicit at the most extreme scale. Jacob Bekenstein and Stephen Hawking showed that the entropy of a black hole, the quantity that measures the disorder, the randomness, the missing information of the system, is proportional not to the black hole's volume, but to the area of its event horizon. The information content of a three-dimensional region of space is determined by its two-dimensional boundary. The interior is a projection of the surface. The volume is a hologram of the area, and this is not a peculiarity of black holes. Gerard Hooft and Leonard Susskind generalized the result into the holographic principle, the proposal that the information content of any volume of space is encoded on the boundary of that space. The three-dimensional world is a projection of a two-dimensional information structure. The bulk is a hologram, and what we call matter, the particles, the forces, the space-time itself is the hologram's projection. Juan Maldacena adds, CFT correspondence, published in 1997, and now the most cited paper in the history of theoretical physics, provided mathematical proof that the holographic principle works in at least one class of universes. Maldacena showed that a theory of gravity in a five-dimensional anti-de Sitter space is mathematically equivalent to a theory of quantum fields on the four-dimensional boundary of that space. The interior, with its gravity, its space-time curvature, its matter and energy, is completely described by the boundary theory, which contains no gravity, no space-time curvature, and no matter. The interior is a projection. The matter is a construction. The gravity is an emergent phenomenon. And the fundamental reality, the reality from which the interior emerges, is a theory of information on the boundary. The implications are staggering. If the holographic principle is correct, and the evidence from string theory, from black hole physics, and from Maldaceno's correspondence increasingly suggests that it is then the three-dimensional world you inhabit is not fundamental. It is a projection, a hologram, a construction emerging from a more fundamental reality that is two-dimensional and purely informational. The solid desk, the warm coffee, the body you inhabit, the brain that constructs your experience. All of it, every atom, every force, every dimension of space, is a projection from a boundary that contains no atoms, no forces, and no dimensions of space. The boundary contains only information, and the information, unfolding according to mathematical rules that we are only beginning to understand, produces the world. The traditions anticipated this. Plato's cave dwellers saw shadows projections from a more fundamental reality they could not directly perceive. The Hindu Maya describes the world as a projection, the formless Brahman, appearing as form through the lens of perception. The Buddhist Shunyata describes phenomena as empty of inherent existence, existing not as self-contained things but as patterns of relationship, patterns of information, patterns of dependent origination that have no substantial core. And the opening of John's Gospel, "In the beginning was the Word," places information, logos, the Word, the rational principle, the divine information before matter, before creation, before the physical universe. First the Word, then the world. First the information, then the projection. The parallel between the ancient insight and the modern physics is not a vague resemblance, it is a structural identity. The traditions say, what you perceive is not fundamental. Something deeper underlies it. The physics says, what you perceive is a holographic projection. Information underlies it. The traditions say, the deeper reality is formless, boundless, and cannot be perceived through the senses. The physics says, the fundamental reality is two-dimensional, abstract, and can only be described mathematically. The traditions say, the world emerges from the deeper reality through a process of manifestation, of projection, of creative unfolding. The physics says, the three-dimensional world emerges from the two-dimensional boundary through the holographic projection of encoded information. Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory, the man who discovered the quantum of action that bears his name, expressed the same conclusion in 1944, at the end of a career that had revolutionized physics. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particles of an atom to vibration. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. Planck was not a mystic. He was the most rigorous physicist of his generation, and he concluded, after decades of working with the equations of quantum mechanics, that matter is not fundamental. The matrix, the pattern, the intelligence, the organizing information, is fundamental. Matter is the expression. Werner Heisenberg, who formulated the uncertainty principle, reached a similar conclusion. The atoms or elementary particles are not real. They form a world of potentialities or possibilities, rather than one of things or facts. The atoms are not things. They are possibilities, mathematical structures, informational patterns, potential states that become actual only when information is generated through measurement. The material world is not a collection of things. It is a field of possibilities, an informational landscape that collapses into specific configurations when observed, measured, or interacted with. The stuff is not stuff. It is possibility, and possibility is information. And Erwin Schrödinger, whose equation governs the behavior of every quantum system, wrote in 1944, the total number of minds in the universe is one, not many minds inhabiting many bodies. One mind, one consciousness, one awareness expressing itself through the multiplicity of forms that the informational universe produces. This is Brahman. This is the Logos. This is the single informational ground that Bohm calls the implicate order, that Wheeler calls the it from bit, that the traditions call the divine mind from which all material reality emanates. The question this investigation must now address is what this means, not merely for physics, not merely for philosophy, but for you, because if matter is not fundamental, if the solid, tangible, visible world is a projection from a deeper informational reality, then you are not what you think you are. You are not a body made of matter. You are a pattern made of information, and the pattern, the informational structure that constitutes your consciousness, your memories, your identity, your experience of being alive may be more fundamental, more real, and more enduring than the material body that the pattern currently inhabits. The next part of this investigation will examine the quantum evidence in detail, the holographic principle, the black hole information paradox, the quantum error-correcting codes that may underlie spacetime itself, and the stunning implication that the universe is not a physical system that contains information, but an informational system that projects the appearance of physicality. The traditions intuited it. Plato allegorized it. The Upanishads proclaimed it. The Buddha analyzed it. And physics, for the first time in its history, is beginning to prove it. The first part of this investigation established the case at the surface level. Matter is not what it appears to be. Atoms are empty. Solidity is electromagnetic repulsion. Color, sound, temperature, and smell are constructions of the brain. The world you experience is a model optimized for survival, not for truth. And the physicists who have looked most carefully at the foundations of reality, Wheeler, Zeilinger, Landauer, Lloyd, have arrived at the same conclusion. Information is more fundamental than matter. It from bit. Every particle, every force, every field derives its existence from information. But the surface case is just the beginning. The observation that atoms are mostly empty space and that the brain constructs sensory experience is remarkable but, in a sense, still compatible with the materialist worldview. The materialist can accept that matter is mostly empty space and that the brain constructs perception, while still maintaining that matter is fundamental, that the atoms are real even if they are mostly empty, and that the brain's constructions are produced by material processes. The materialist position is wounded by the surface case but not defeated. The deeper case defeats it. The deeper case does not merely show that matter is strange, it shows that matter is secondary. It shows that information, not matter, not energy, not force, is the fundamental substance from which reality is constructed. And it shows this not through philosophical argument but through experimental evidence, mathematical proof, and the convergence of independent theoretical frameworks developed by physicists working at the highest levels of the discipline. The deeper case, the case that transforms information from an important concept in physics to the foundational substance of reality, comes from 4 discoveries in quantum mechanics and theoretical physics that together constitute the most radical revolution in our understanding of existence since the scientific revolution itself. These discoveries are the quantum eraser experiment, which demonstrates that information determines reality retroactively; quantum entanglement, which demonstrates that information transcends space; the black hole information paradox, which demonstrates that information is the most conserved quantity in the universe; and the holographic principle, which demonstrates that the 3-dimensional world we inhabit may be a projection of information encoded on a 2-dimensional surface. The quantum eraser experiment is the most disturbing experiment in the history of physics. It is more disturbing than the double-slit experiment, which is already disturbing enough. In the double-slit experiment, the act of acquiring information about which slit a particle passes through changes the behavior of the particle from a wave pattern to a particle pattern. Information determines reality. This much we have established. But the quantum eraser takes it further into territory that violates every intuition about how the world works. The experiment was proposed by Marlon Scully and Kai Drull in 1982 and first performed by Yoon Ho Kim and colleagues in 1999. The setup is this. A photon is fired at a double slit, just as in the standard experiment. But before the photon reaches the screen, it passes through a special crystal that splits it into two entangled photons, a signal photon that continues to the detection screen, and an idler photon that is diverted to a separate detector. The idler photon carries which path information about which slit the signal photon passed through, and as long as the idler photon carries this information, the signal photon behaves as a particle, producing no interference pattern on the screen. Now comes the erasure. The idler photon is directed through a series of beam splitters that either preserve the which path information or erase it depending on which detector the idler photon happens to reach. If the which path information is preserved, the signal photon produces a particle pattern. If the which path information is erased, the signal photon produces an interference pattern as though it had passed through both slits simultaneously, as though it had never been observed, as though the information had never existed. The timing is what makes the experiment disturbing. The signal photon hits the detection screen before the idler photon reaches its detector. The signal photon has already been recorded. Its position on the screen has already been measured before the decision to preserve or erase the which path information has been made. And yet the pattern on the screen depends on that decision. If the information is erased even after the signal photon has been recorded, the interference pattern appears. If the information is preserved even after the signal photon has been recorded, the particle pattern appears. The information does not merely influence the present, it influences the past. The decision to erase or preserve information about a photon's path retroactively determines the behavior of a photon that has already been detected. The cause comes after the effect. The information determines the reality, and it does so backward through time. This is not an interpretation. It is not a philosophical gloss on ambiguous data. It is the experimental result replicated, confirmed, published in peer-reviewed journals, accepted by the physics community. Information determines reality, and it determines reality retroactively. The implications are staggering, and they connect directly to the retrocausality we explored in the karma investigation and the future self investigation. If information can reach backward through time to determine the behavior of particles, then the temporal direction of causation is not fixed. The future can influence the past, and the medium through which this influence operates is not energy, not force, not matter, it is information. The quantum eraser reveals something else, something that is easy to miss, but that is perhaps the most profound implication of the entire experiment. The signal photon's behavior is not determined by the physical act of observation. It is determined by the existence or non-existence of information. If the which path information exists somewhere in the universe, even if no human being has looked at it, even if it is recorded on a detector that no one will ever check, the interference pattern disappears. If the which path information is erased, even if no human being performed the erasure, even if the erasure was carried out by a random quantum process, the interference pattern returns. The photon does not care about human observation, it cares about information. The universe tracks its own information content and adjusts its behavior accordingly, regardless of whether any conscious being is watching. This is the deepest lesson of the quantum eraser. Reality is not made of stuff, it is made of information. And the information is not a human construct, not a story that minds tell about particles, not a description that physicists impose on nature. The information is the reality. The particles are the description. We have it backward. We think that particles are real and information is abstract. The quantum eraser demonstrates that information is real, and particles are the abstractions, the patterns that information produces when it interacts with the measurement apparatus that physics has built to detect it. Quantum entanglement reveals the second fundamental property of information. It transcends space. We have encountered entanglement in every investigation we have conducted. It is the quantum phenomenon that refuses to stay in the background. Two particles that have interacted become entangled, their quantum states are correlated, and a measurement on one instantly determines the state of the other, regardless of the distance between them. The 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Elaine Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger for their experimental confirmation that this correlation is real, that it cannot be explained by hidden variables, and that it violates Bell's inequality, the mathematical boundary that separates classical correlation from quantum entanglement. But entanglement is not merely a correlation between particles. It is a correlation of information. When two particles are entangled, they do not share a substance. They do not exchange a signal. They share information, quantum information, encoded in the entangled state, distributed non-locally across any distance. The entangled particles do not know about each other in any physical sense. There is no wire connecting them, no field mediating their correlation, no signal passing between them at any speed. They are connected through information, through the quantum state that describes them as a single system, through the mathematical relationship that defines their correlation, through the information content of the entangled pair. The experiments have been definitive. Aspect performed the first rigorous test in 1982, separating entangled photons by 12 meters and showing that their correlations violated Bell's inequality. Subsequent experiments extended the distance to hundreds of meters, to kilometers, to the 143 kilometers between the Canary Islands of La Palma and Tenerife in Zeilinger's 2012 experiment. In 2017, the Chinese satellite Micius distributed entangled photons to ground stations separated by 1,200 kilometers, and the correlations held. In every case, 12 meters or 1,200 kilometers, the correlation was instantaneous. The violation of Bell's inequality was clear, and the informational connection between the particles was maintained regardless of spatial separation. The significance for the information first picture cannot be overstated. If particles were fundamental, if the universe were made of stuff, then separating stuff by 1,200 kilometers should sever any connection between the separated pieces. Stuff is local. Stuff occupies specific locations. Stuff cannot be in two places at once, but information can. Information is not local in the way that matter is local. A correlation is not a thing. It does not have a location. It does not occupy space. It does not travel from one place to another. A correlation is a relationship, and a relationship exists in the informational structure that describes the related entities, not in the entities themselves. Entanglement demonstrates that the informational structure is more fundamental than the entities it describes. The relationship is more real than the things that are related. This is why Einstein called entanglement spooky action at a distance, because it seemed to violate the principle that physical influences cannot travel faster than light. But entanglement does not violate this principle, because entanglement is not a physical influence. It is an informational correlation. No signal is sent. No energy is transmitted. No physical interaction occurs. The information is simply correlated instantaneously across any distance, as a feature of the quantum state itself. The information does not travel through space. It transcends space. It exists in a domain that is not spatial, a domain that physics is only beginning to describe, and that the traditions have been describing for millennia as the implicate order, as the Akashic field, as the mind of God. The black hole information paradox reveals the third fundamental property of information. It is indestructible. In the 1970s, Stephen Hawking demonstrated that black holes are not truly black, they emit radiation, now called Hawking radiation, through a quantum process at the event horizon. The radiation causes the black hole to lose mass. Over immense timescales, the black hole evaporates completely, shrinking, radiating, and eventually disappearing entirely. The question that Hawking's discovery raised was, what happens to the information that fell into the black hole, the matter that crossed the event horizon, stars, planets, spacecraft, the accumulated information content of everything that entered? Was it destroyed when the black hole evaporated? Hawking initially argued that it was. The information was lost, destroyed, gone forever. This was Hawking's information loss paradox, and it provoked one of the most intense debates in the history of theoretical physics. Because the loss of information violates a fundamental principle of quantum mechanics, unitarity. Unitarity states that the total information content of a closed quantum system is conserved over time. Information can be transformed, scrambled, redistributed, encoded in different forms, but it cannot be destroyed. Unitarity is not an optional feature of quantum mechanics. It is a mathematical consequence of the Schrödinger equation, the fundamental equation that governs the evolution of quantum states. If unitarity is violated, quantum mechanics is wrong. And quantum mechanics is the most precisely confirmed theory in the history of science. Its predictions have been verified to 14 decimal places. The debate lasted 30 years. And in the end, Hawking conceded. In 2004, at a conference in Dublin, Hawking publicly changed his position, acknowledging that information is not destroyed by black holes, that it is preserved in the Hawking radiation, and that unitarity holds. Hawking paid a bet he had made with John Preskill of Caltech, presenting Preskill with a baseball encyclopedia, the information content of which symbolized the information that Hawking now accepted was preserved by the black hole. The gesture was playful, the physics was profound. The most extreme physical process in the universe, the gravitational collapse of a star into a singularity, and the subsequent evaporation of the black hole through quantum radiation, does not destroy information. Nothing does. Nothing can. The concession was historic, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, admitting that he had been wrong about one of the deepest questions in physics. And the implication was equally historic. Information cannot be destroyed, not even by the most extreme physical conditions in the universe, not even by the gravitational collapse of a star into a singularity, not even by the complete evaporation of a black hole. Information is conserved, always, everywhere, under all conditions. Consider the weight of what has just been established. The most extreme gravitational phenomenon in the universe, a black hole, cannot destroy information. A nuclear explosion can destroy matter, converting it to energy through Einstein's E equals mc squared. A chemical reaction can destroy molecules, breaking bonds and rearranging atoms. Entropy can destroy order, randomizing organized systems into disorder. But none of these processes, not even the most violent, not even the most extreme, can destroy information. The information is transformed, redistributed, scrambled, encoded in radiation and scattered across the cosmos, but it is never lost. The universe keeps its records. Every bit of information that has ever existed still exists. Every quantum event, every particle interaction, every measurement, every observation, every thought that has been physically instantiated in the neural architecture of a brain, all of it is preserved in the total quantum state of the universe. This has implications for every investigation we have conducted. The karmic traces we described, the information deposited in the quantum field by intentional action, cannot be erased. The somatic markers, the epigenetic modifications, the neural pathway changes, all the biological mechanisms of karma are physical instantiations of information, and information is conserved. Karma is not a metaphor, it is physics. The traces persist because information persists, and information persists because the universe, at its deepest level, is made of information, and information is the one thing that the universe does not allow to be destroyed. The hierarchy is now clear. Matter can be destroyed. Nuclear reactions convert matter into energy. Energy can be transformed. Energy changes form continuously, from kinetic to potential, to thermal, to electromagnetic. But information cannot be destroyed. It is the most conserved quantity in physics, more fundamental than matter, more fundamental than energy, more fundamental than the particles and forces that physics has traditionally treated as the building blocks of reality. Information is the bottom. Information is what remains when everything else is stripped away. Jacob Bekenstein, a physicist at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, discovered the quantitative relationship between information and physical reality that makes the holographic principle possible. Bekenstein showed that the maximum amount of information that can be contained in any region of space is proportional not to the volume of the region, but to its surface area. This is the Bekenstein bound, and it is one of the most counterintuitive results in physics. Bekenstein derived it from the thermodynamics of black holes, where the entropy, the information content, is proportional to the surface area of the event horizon, measured in Planck units, 1 bit per 4 Planck areas. The Planck area is unimaginably small, approximately 10 to the minus 66 square centimeters, which means that the surface of a black hole can encode an astronomically large amount of information. But the point is not the quantity, the point is the location. The information is on the surface, not in the volume. The depth of the black hole, the volume inside the event horizon, the three-dimensional space that the singularity occupies, contains no more information than is already encoded on the two-dimensional surface. Think about what this means for the everyday world. The room you are sitting in, the air you are breathing, the body you inhabit, everything that fills the three-dimensional volume of your experience, all of it, according to the Bekenstein bound, contains no more information than could be encoded on the walls, floor, and ceiling that bound the room. The interior is the hologram, the boundary is the source, and the information on the boundary is the reality from which the interior is projected. Volume seems more fundamental than surface area. A larger volume should contain more stuff and therefore more information than a smaller volume. But Bekenstein proved mathematically that this is wrong. The information content of a region is determined by its boundary, not its interior. The surface determines the content, the boundary determines the bulk. This result initially derived for black holes, where the information content equals 1 bit per 4 Planck areas of the event horizon, was generalized by Gerard Hooft and Leonard Susskind into the holographic principle. All the information contained in any volume of space can be described by a theory that lives on the boundary of that space. The three-dimensional interior is a projection, a holographic image generated by information encoded on the two-dimensional boundary. The depth dimension, the third spatial dimension that gives the world its feeling of three-dimensionality, is not fundamental. It is emergent. It arises from the information on the boundary. The world is a hologram. Juan Maldacena, a theoretical physicist at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, provided the mathematical proof in 1997. Maldacena proposed the ADS-CFT correspondence, a mathematical duality between a theory of gravity in a five-dimensional anti-de Sitter space and a conformal field theory on the four-dimensional boundary of that space. The duality is exact. Every calculation in the bulk theory has a precise counterpart in the boundary theory, and vice versa. The physics of the interior, including gravity, matter, energy, space-time, curvature, is completely and exactly described by the information theory on the boundary. The bulk is the hologram. The boundary is the reality. The three-dimensional world of objects and forces and space-time is a projection of a two-dimensional information structure. Maldacena's paper, published in 1997, has become the most cited paper in the history of theoretical physics, with over 20,000 citations. The reason is not merely that it is mathematically elegant, it is that it provides the first concrete, rigorous, calculable example of how a physical universe, complete with gravity and matter and all the complexity of general relativity, can be exactly equivalent to an information theory on a lower dimensional surface. The correspondence is not approximate, it is not an analogy. It is an exact mathematical duality. Every graviton in the bulk corresponds to a specific operator on the boundary. Every black hole in the bulk corresponds to a specific thermal state on the boundary. Every event in the bulk, no matter how dramatic, no matter how physical, no matter how three-dimensional it appears, is exactly and completely described by information on the boundary. The Maldacena correspondence has been called the most important result in theoretical physics in the last 25 years, and for good reason. It does not merely suggest that the world might be a hologram. It proves mathematically, rigorously, within a specific theoretical framework, that a fully three-dimensional physical reality, complete with gravity and matter and space-time, can be exactly reproduced by an information theory on a lower dimensional surface. The bulk is the shadow, the surface is the substance, and the substance is information. The most recent and perhaps most revolutionary development in information physics comes from the work on quantum error correction and the emergence of space-time. Ahmed Almhiri, Shi Dong, and Daniel Harlow demonstrated in 2015 that the structure of space-time itself, the geometric fabric that Einstein described in general relativity, can be understood as a quantum error-correcting code. In classical computing, error-correcting codes protect information from corruption by encoding it redundantly, distributing the information across multiple physical locations so that damage to any single location does not destroy the information. Almhiri, Dong, and Harlow showed that the same mathematical structure governs the relationship between the boundary information and the bulk geometry in the holographic correspondence. Space-time is an error-correcting code. The geometry of the universe is the structure that protects information from loss. This is worth pausing to absorb. The fabric of reality, the space-time continuum that Einstein spent a decade formulating in his general theory of relativity, the curved geometry that describes gravity and determines the motion of planets, stars, and galaxies, is a code, not metaphorically, mathematically. The same mathematical structures that computer scientists use to protect data from corruption in digital storage and transmission are the mathematical structures that govern the relationship between the boundary information and the bulk geometry of the universe. The universe is not merely described by information. The universe is built to protect information. The geometry of space-time, the curvature of space, the expansion of the cosmos, The very structure of reality exists because information needs to be preserved. If this sounds theological, it should. The traditions have been saying for millennia that the universe exists for a purpose, that reality is not random but ordered, that the cosmos is structured by an intelligence that values preservation, coherence, and meaning. The physics does not confirm the theological interpretation, but it describes a universe that behaves as though information matters, as though preservation matters, as though the structure of reality is organized around the protection of something that is more fundamental than the structure itself. Mark van Raamsdonk, a physicist at the University of British Columbia, extended this insight with a remarkable proposal: space-time emerges from quantum entanglement. Van Raamsdonk showed that if you systematically reduce the entanglement between regions of the boundary theory, if you disentangle the information, the corresponding regions of the bulk space-time separate, they become disconnected. The geometry tears. The space-time fabric is pulled apart not by a physical force but by the removal of informational correlations. Entanglement holds space-time together. Information creates space, and the removal of information destroys space. The implication is extraordinary. Space, the arena in which all physical events occur, is not fundamental. It is emergent. It arises from information, from the entanglement structure of the quantum state, from the correlations between the informational degrees of freedom on the boundary. Time, too, may be emergent, as several theoretical frameworks suggest, including the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, which describes the quantum state of the universe without any reference to time at all. The equation suggests that time, like space, is not a fundamental feature of reality, but an emergent property of the informational structure, a way that information organizes itself into patterns that conscious observers experience as temporal sequence. If space and time are both emergent from information, then information is more fundamental than space-time itself. Information does not exist in space and time. Space and time exist in information. The container is the content. The stage is made of the play. And the play, the fundamental drama from which all of reality is projected, is informational. The equation that captures this relationship, the Ryu-Takayanagi formula, states that the entanglement entropy of a region of the boundary theory is proportional to the area of the minimal surface. In the bulk that encloses that region, entropy is information. Area is geometry. The equation says information equals geometry. The amount of entanglement between boundary regions determines the shape of the bulk spacetime. The informational correlations create the spatial structure. Space is made of information, not metaphorically, mathematically. David Bohm's implicate order, which we have encountered in investigation after investigation, is the philosophical framework that most naturally accommodates the information first picture. In the implicate order, the fundamental reality is not particles, not fields, not space-time. It is an undivided and folded totality, a deep structure in which everything is connected to everything else, through a web of information that transcends spatial separation and temporal sequence. The explicate order, the world of separate objects, distinct locations, and sequential events, is a projection from the implicate order, just as the three-dimensional bulk is a projection from the two-dimensional boundary in the holographic principle. Bohm used the analogy of the hologram to explain the implicate order decades before the holographic principle was formulated. In a hologram, every part contains information about the whole. Break the holographic plate in half, and each half still contains the entire image at reduced resolution, but complete. Similarly, in the implicate order, every region of reality contains information about every other region. Nothing is isolated, nothing is separate. Everything is enfolded into everything else through the informational structure of the implicate order. Bohm went further than the holographic analogy. He proposed that consciousness itself participates in the implicate order, that the mind is not separate from the informational fabric of reality but is an expression of it. Thought is a form of information. Perception is a form of information. Intention is a form of information. And these forms of information interact with the physical forms of information, the particles and fields and space-time geometry, through the implicate order, through the deep informational structure that underlies both mind and matter. In Bohm's framework, the Cartesian division between mind and matter is dissolved. Both are projections from the same informational source. Both are patterns in the same implicate order. And the division between them, the sense that mind is in here and matter is out there, is a feature of the explicate order's projection, not a feature of the implicate reality. The connection between Bohm's implicate order and the holographic principle is not a coincidence. It is a convergence, two independent theoretical frameworks developed by physicists working in different traditions and different decades, arriving at the same conclusion: the visible, tangible, three-dimensional world of objects and forces is a projection from a deeper informational reality that is non-local, non-temporal, and fundamentally different from the world that the senses reveal. And the convergence extends further into the traditions that we will explore in the next part of this investigation, because the traditions did not wait for Wheeler or Bekenstein or Maldacena or Van Raamsdonk. They arrived at the same conclusion millennia ago in different languages, through different methods, with different vocabularies, but with a structural consistency that is becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the information, the divine code that precedes and produces the material world. Mind precedes all things. The Dhammapada's declaration that consciousness and information are prior to matter. Kun fayakun, the divine command that creates reality through the act of speaking, through the issuance of information. The traditions describe an information-first universe. The physics is catching up. And the convergence, the structural alignment between what the traditions intuited through contemplative practice and what the physics demonstrates through mathematical proof and experimental evidence, is becoming too precise and too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The next part of this investigation will enter the traditions fully and hear their descriptions of the informational nature of reality. Because the traditions did not merely assert that information precedes matter, they described the mechanism. They named the informational ground. They mapped the relationship between the divine code and the material world with a specificity that, in light of the holographic principle, the quantum eraser, and the emergence of space-time from entanglement, reads less like mythology and more like physics expressed in the language of the sacred. The physics says, information precedes matter. The holographic principle says, three-dimensional reality is a projection from a two-dimensional informational surface. The quantum eraser says, information determines reality retroactively. Entanglement says, information transcends space. The black hole information paradox says, information is indestructible. And the emergence of space-time from entanglement says, space and time themselves are products of informational structure, not the containers within which information exists. These are not ancient claims dressed in modern language. They are modern discoveries, published in the last 3 decades, confirmed by experiment and mathematical proof, awarded Nobel Prizes, and accepted by the mainstream physics community. And yet when we turn to the traditions and hear what they have been saying for millennia about the nature of reality, the resonance between the ancient descriptions and the modern discoveries is so precise, so structural, so deeply aligned that it demands attention. The traditions did not have the mathematics. They did not have the experiments. They did not have the vocabulary of qubits, holographic duality, or quantum error correction, but they described in their own languages, through their own methods, across every culture and every century, a reality in which information is prior to matter, in which the word precedes the world, in which the code generates the cosmos. Christianity places information at the absolute foundation of reality, and does so in the opening sentence of its most philosophically sophisticated gospel. "In the beginning was the Word," John writes, "and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." The Greek term that John uses, logos, carries a weight of meaning that the English translation word cannot convey. Logos means word, but it also means reason, principle, pattern, logic, rational structure, information. It is the root of every ology in English: biology, psychology, theology, cosmology, each of which means the rational study of its subject. Logos is the rational structure of reality, and John is saying, this rational structure, this information, this pattern is God, is with God, is the means through which all things were made. Nothing was made without it. The claim is ontological, not merely poetic. John is not saying that God spoke and things happened to appear. He is saying that the logos, the informational structure, the rational pattern, the divine code, is the substance from which all things are made. Matter does not exist independently of the logos. Matter is the expression of the logos. Matter is what the logos looks like when it manifests in the domain that human senses can perceive. The word becomes flesh, information becomes matter, and the becoming is the act of creation. John is describing the same process that the holographic principle describes, an informational source generating a material projection. The logos is the boundary, the flesh is the bulk. And the incarnation, the central event of Christian theology, is the ultimate instance of information becoming matter, of the divine code taking physical form, of the holographic projection achieving its maximum density in a specific human body at a specific point in history. The early church fathers developed this informational theology with extraordinary philosophical sophistication. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the 2nd century, described the logos as the divine reason that pervades all creation, the rational structure that gives order to chaos, the informational principle that makes the universe intelligible. Without the logos, Clement argued, the universe would be unintelligible, not because human minds would fail to understand it, but because there would be nothing to understand. Intelligibility is not a feature of the human mind. It is a feature of reality, a feature that the logos provides. The universe is comprehensible because it is made of comprehensible stuff, of information, of rational structure, of the same logos that the human mind participates in when it thinks, reasons, and understands. Maximus the Confessor, the 7th century Byzantine theologian, pushed the informational theology further with his concept of the logoi, the plural words or principles that constitute the informational blueprint of every created thing. Each created thing has its own logos, its own informational pattern, its own rational structure, its own divine blueprint. The logos of a tree determines what a tree is. The logos of a star determines what a star is. The logos of a human being determines what a human being is. And all logoi, all the informational blueprints of all created things, are contained in the one, logos, the divine word that John describes as the source of all creation. The logoi are the logos particularized. Creation is the logos diversified. The universe is the logos expressed in an infinity of specific informational patterns, each reflecting the whole from a unique angle, each holographic fragment containing information about the totality. Creation is not the production of matter from nothing. It is the projection of information into material form. It is, in the language of the holographic principle, the generation of a three-dimensional bulk from a lower-dimensional informational source. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican theologian, whose synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology remains the intellectual foundation of Catholic thought, developed this insight into a comprehensive metaphysics of information. Aquinas argued that everything that exists has a form, an essential pattern, a rational structure, an informational blueprint that determines what the thing is. The form of a horse is the informational pattern that makes a horse and not a cow. The form of water is the informational structure that makes water and not wine. And all forms, every pattern, every structure, every informational blueprint for every possible thing exist first in the mind of God. God's mind contains the total information content of all possible realities. Creation is the act of selecting specific forms from this infinite informational library and projecting them into material existence. Matter is the medium. Information is the message. And God, the divine mind, the infinite information processor, the Logos, is the source. Augustine, writing 8 centuries before Aquinas, had already described the same structure in different language. Augustine called the informational blueprints divine ideas, rationes aeternae, eternal reasons that exist in the mind of God as the templates for all created things. The material world is not self-subsistent. It does not contain its own explanation. It is a reflection, a projection, a shadow, a hologram of the divine ideas that precede it and that give it form, structure, meaning, and existence. Without the divine ideas, matter is formless tohu wa bohu, the formless and void of Genesis 1-2. With the divine ideas, matter takes shape, the information organizes the chaos, the code generates the cosmos, the word becomes world. The resonance with the holographic principle is structural. The holographic principle says, the three-dimensional bulk is a projection from a two-dimensional informational boundary. Augustine says, the material world is a projection from the divine ideas in the mind of God. The holographic principle says, the information on the boundary is the reality. The bulk is the hologram. Augustine says, the divine ideas are the reality. The material world is the reflection. The holographic principle says, every calculation in the bulk can be exactly reproduced by a calculation on the boundary. Augustine says, every feature of the material world can be traced to a corresponding divine idea that is its cause, its template, and its sustaining principle. The vocabulary is different. The structure is identical. Hinduism arrives at the same conclusion from a different starting point and articulates it with a philosophical depth that has no parallel in any other tradition. The foundational claim of Hindu metaphysics is expressed in the Mandukya Upanishad's analysis of Brahman as Satchitananda being, consciousness, bliss. The order is significant. Being comes first, existence, reality, the fact that something rather than nothing exists. Consciousness comes second, awareness, information processing, the capacity to know, and bliss comes third, the experiential quality of the union between being and consciousness, the joy that arises when awareness recognizes itself in existence. But consciousness, chit, is not a byproduct of being. It is constitutive of being. Being without consciousness is not merely incomplete, it is impossible. The Upanishadic insight, refined through centuries of philosophical debate between the Advaita Vedanta, Vishishtadvaita, and Dvaita schools, is that consciousness is not produced by matter. Matter is produced by consciousness. Consciousness is the ground. Matter is the figure, information is the source, physicality is the projection. The concept of Maya illusion is the Hindu tradition's way of describing the relationship between the informational ground and the material projection. Maya does not mean that the material world does not exist. It means that the material world does not exist in the way that it appears to exist. It appears to be self-subsistent, to exist independently, on its own, without reference to anything deeper, but it is not self-subsistent. It is a projection, a manifestation of Brahman, a holographic image generated by the consciousness that is the ground of all reality. The material world is real in the sense that it is experienced. It is unreal in the sense that it is not fundamental. Shankara, the 8th century philosopher who systematized Advaita Vedanta, used the analogy of the rope and the snake. A man walking at dusk sees a rope on the path and perceives a snake. The snake is real in the sense that it produces fear, adrenaline, and evasive behavior. The snake is unreal in the sense that it is not actually there. It is a projection of the mind onto a substrate, the rope, that is something else entirely. When the man looks more carefully, when the light improves, when perception sharpens, the snake disappears and the rope is seen for what it is. The snake was never the reality. The rope was always the reality. And the transformation from snake perception to rope perception is not a change in the world. It is a change in information, a correction of the perceptual model, an update of the informational state, a shift from less accurate to more accurate representation of what is actually there. Maya operates at the cosmic level, the way the rope-snake illusion operates at the individual level. The material world is the snake, a projection of consciousness onto Brahman, a perceptual model that is experienced as real but that is not fundamental. Brahman is the rope, the informational ground, the conscious reality that was always there, but that Maya conceals behind the projection of material forms. And liberation, moksha, is the moment when the illusion is seen through, when the snake dissolves and the rope is perceived, when the material projection is recognized as a projection and the informational ground is directly known. It is not the bottom. There is something beneath it, something informational, something conscious, something that the tradition calls Brahman and that the physics calls information. The Akashic records the concept of a cosmic information field that contains the complete record of every event, every thought, every intention that has ever occurred, maps onto the physics of information conservation with remarkable precision. The unitarity of quantum mechanics guarantees that information is never destroyed. Every quantum event is permanently recorded in the total quantum state of the universe. The Akashic records are the traditional description of this conservation expressed in the language of the sacred, experienced through contemplative practice rather than mathematical proof, but describing the same fundamental property of reality. Information is preserved, always, everything, forever. The concept of spanda vibration, pulsation, the dynamic creative activity of consciousness, adds a processual dimension to the Hindu information picture. Spanda is the informational activity that generates reality, the continuous creative pulsation of consciousness that produces, sustains, and dissolves the material world. Reality is not a static structure. It is a dynamic process, an ongoing computation, an unceasing flow of information, a continuous projection from the informational ground to the material surface. The universe is not a thing. It is a happening, an informational event, a computational process, a continuous act of creation in which consciousness projects itself into material form and then withdraws, projects and withdraws, in an endless cycle of manifestation and dissolution that the tradition calls the breath of Brahman, and that the physics describes as the continuous evolution of the quantum state. Buddhism approaches the information-first position through the doctrine of shunyata emptiness, and the principle of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination. The Heart Sutra's famous declaration, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form," is not a paradox. It is a precise ontological statement. Form, the material world, the world of objects and boundaries and distinct things, is empty of intrinsic existence. It does not exist on its own. It does not contain its own explanation. It is empty shunya of self-nature. But emptiness is not nothing. Emptiness is form. The emptiness from which form arises is not a void. It is a plenum, a fullness of potentiality, an informational ground from which all possible forms can emerge. Nagarjuna, the 2nd century Indian philosopher, who is regarded as the most important Buddhist thinker after the Buddha, developed shunyata into a rigorous philosophical system that anticipates, with extraordinary precision, the information-first picture of modern physics. Nagarjuna argued that nothing exists independently. Everything exists in dependence on conditions, on relationships, on the web of connections that link every phenomenon to every other phenomenon. This is pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, the principle that nothing arises on its own and everything arises in dependence on everything else. And the web of dependence, the network of relationships, the structure of connections that links all phenomena, is information, not matter, not energy, not substance. Information, the relational structure that determines what arises, how it arises, and in dependence on what it arises. Nagarjuna's argument is precise. If anything existed independently, if it had svabhava, self-nature, intrinsic existence, then it would exist, without conditions, without causes, without relationships. It would be eternal, unchanging, and isolated. But nothing in the universe has these properties. Everything changes. Everything depends on conditions. Everything is connected to everything else through the web of dependent origination. Therefore nothing has svabhava. Everything is shunya, empty of intrinsic existence. But emptiness is not nothingness. It is the absence of independent existence, which is simultaneously the presence of relational existence, the presence of the informational web that connects all phenomena. The parallel to modern physics is striking. A particle, in quantum mechanics, does not have definite properties independently of measurement. It does not have a position until position is measured. It does not have a momentum until momentum is measured. Its properties are relational. They exist only in relation to the measurement apparatus, only in the context of an interaction, only within the informational web that connects the particle to the observer. The particle is shunya, empty of intrinsic properties, and its properties are pratitya samutpada, dependently originated, arising from the relational structure of the quantum interaction. Nagarjuna could not have known about quantum mechanics, but his analysis of emptiness and dependent origination describes, with extraordinary precision, the relational ontology that quantum mechanics reveals. Not matter, not energy, not substance, information, the relational structure that determines what arises, how it arises, and in dependence on what it arises. The Yogacara school of Buddhism, which we explored in the subconscious investigation, takes this further with the doctrine of vijnaptimatrata, representation only, or mind only. The Yogacara philosophers argue that what we experience as the external material world is not external and not material. It is a representation, a projection of the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, which contains the seeds of all possible experiences. The seeds are informational, they are patterns, tendencies, potentialities, codes that generate specific experiences when the conditions for their activation arise. The material world is not out there. It is in here, in the informational structure of consciousness, in the seeds stored in the alaya vijnana, in the code from which experience is generated. The Yogacara position is not solipsism. It does not deny that reality exists. It denies that reality is material. Reality is informational, and the information is stored, processed, and projected by consciousness. The Dhammapada, the most widely read text in the Pali Canon, opens with a statement that places information at the foundation of reality with the same directness as John's Gospel. Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-wrought. The Pali word translated as mind, mano, refers not merely to the individual human mind, but to the principle of awareness, of knowing, of information processing that the Buddhist tradition identifies as prior to and more fundamental than material reality. The material world is mind-wrought, constructed by the informational activity of consciousness, projected from the mental ground into the experiential surface, generated by the same kind of informational process that the holographic principle describes in the language of physics. Islam places divine information at the origin of creation, with a directness and a specificity that connects to the physics with surprising precision. The Quranic account of creation centers on a single word, kun. When he decrees a matter, he only says to it, be, and it is Quran 2-117, kun fayakun be, and it is. Creation is a speech act. It is the issuance of information, a divine command, a cosmic instruction, a bit of information that transforms possibility into actuality. The act of creation is not the manipulation of pre-existing matter. It is the projection of information into material form. God does not build the universe from parts. God speaks the universe into existence. The creation is linguistic. It is informational. It is the output of a divine computation that takes possibility as input and produces actuality as output through the single operation of the divine command, be. The Quran extends this informational cosmology throughout its text, and with him are the keys of the unseen. None knows them except him, and he knows what is on the land and in the sea. Not a leaf falls but that he knows it. Quran 6:59. The divine knowledge is total, comprehensive, omniscient, encompassing every event at every scale, from the falling of a leaf to the expansion of the cosmos. This is the theological expression of the Bekenstein bound, the total information content of reality, known, preserved, and accessible. Nothing is lost. Nothing is forgotten. Every bit of information, every quantum event, every falling leaf is recorded in the divine database that the Quran calls Al-Lahor Al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet. A hadith prophetic tradition states, Allah wrote the measurements of creation 50,000 years before he created the heavens and the earth. The measurements, the maqadir, the specifications, the informational parameters precede the creation. The code precedes the cosmos. The blueprint precedes the building. Information precedes matter by 50,000 years, a number that is symbolic of vastness, of the temporal priority of information over physicality, of the fact that the plan existed before the execution. The word, the information, precedes the world, and the world is the word made manifest. The concept of Allah al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet, extends the information first picture into a comprehensive cosmic information architecture. The preserved tablet is the record of everything, every event that has occurred, every event that will occur, every decree, every destiny, every quantum of information that constitutes the history and the future of the universe. It is the cosmic database, the total information content of reality, preserved by divine decree, indestructible, comprehensive, and complete. The preserved tablet is the Akashic records of Islam. It is the unitarity of quantum mechanics expressed in theological language. It is the Bekenstein bound applied to the cosmos, the complete information content of the universe, encoded, preserved, and accessible to the divine consciousness that created it. Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Andalusian Sufi philosopher, whose metaphysical system is among the most sophisticated in any tradition, developed the concept of the ayan al-thabita, the fixed essences, or permanent archetypes. The ayan al-thabita are the informational templates that exist in the divine knowledge, patterns, the blueprints, the codes for every possible thing. They are not created, they are eternal features of God's knowledge. And creation is the process by which these informational templates are projected into material existence. The tajalli, the divine self-disclosure, the act by which the hidden information becomes manifest reality. Ibn Arabi's system is, in its essential structure, a holographic cosmology, the material world as a projection from an informational source, the bulk as a hologram of the boundary, the world as a tajalli of the divine code. The Daoist tradition opens the Tao Te Ching with a statement that places the informational principle at the foundation of reality. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The Tao, the way, the principle, the informational order that underlies all phenomena is not a thing. It is not matter. It is not energy. It is the pattern, the structure, the code from which all things emerge. The Tao gives birth to one. One gives birth to two. Two gives birth to three. Three gives birth to the 10,000 things. The sequence is informational from the simple to the complex, from the undifferentiated to the differentiated, from the single principle to the infinite diversity of the manifest world. The Tao is the source code. The 10,000 things are the output, and the process of generation from source to output, from code to cosmos, from information to matter, is the continuous creative activity that the Taoist tradition calls the way of heaven. The Kabbalistic tradition in Judaism provides perhaps the most explicitly informational cosmology in any tradition. The Sephirot, the 10 divine attributes through which God creates and sustains the universe, are informational structures. They are not substances. They are not forces. They are qualities of divine information, wisdom, chokmah, understanding, binah, knowledge, da'at, kindness, chesed, judgment, gevurah, beauty, tiferet, eternity, netzach, splendor, hod, foundation, yesod, and sovereignty, malkut. The material world malkut, the lowest sephirah, is the final projection of the informational structure that begins with Ein Sof, the infinite, the source beyond all attributes, and descends through the sephirot in a cascade of informational differentiation. Each sephirah adds specificity, more information, more structure, more determination, until the informational cascade reaches its maximum density and becomes the material world. Matter is the densest form of information. Spirit is the subtlest form. And the process of creation, the tzimtzum, the divine contraction, is the process by which the infinite, undifferentiated information of Ein Sof contracts, differentiates, and progressively specifies itself until it reaches the density of material existence. The Kabbalistic concept of tzimtzum describes this process with an imagery that resonates with the holographic principle. God withdraws contracts, creating a vacant space, chalal, within the infinite divine light. Into this vacant space, God projects a ray of light, the kav, that carries the informational structure of the sephirot. The material world is produced by the progressive filtering and densification of this informational ray, each sephirah adding more specification, more determination, more structure, until the information reaches its maximum density and becomes the physical world of Malkut. The process is a dimensional reduction from the infinite dimensionality of Ein Sof to the finite dimensionality of the material world. It is an information cascade from the simple unity of the divine source to the complex multiplicity of the created world. And it is, in its essential structure, a holographic projection from the informational source to the material manifestation, from the boundary to the bulk, from the code to the cosmos. The Hebrew tradition also contributes the concept of creation through language. God creates by speaking, "Let there be light," and there was light. Each act of creation is a speech act, a linguistic event, an informational event, a divine utterance that transforms possibility into actuality. The Hebrew letters themselves are considered creative forces in the Kabbalistic tradition. Each letter a specific informational channel through which divine energy flows into the world. The Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, one of the oldest Kabbalistic texts, describes how God created the universe through the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the 10 Sephirot, combining letters into words, words into sentences, sentences into the continuous creative speech that sustains the universe in existence from moment to moment. Creation is not a past event. It is an ongoing process, a continuous informational projection that maintains the material world in existence through the ceaseless creative speech of the divine. And the entire tree of Sephirot is the informational hierarchy that connects them, the divine code that generates the cosmos through progressive informational disclosure. The convergence across traditions is not thematic. It is structural. Every tradition places information, word, logos, consciousness, mind, command, Tao, Sephirot, prior to matter. Every tradition describes the material world as a projection, a manifestation, a disclosure, a hologram of an informational source that is more fundamental, more real, and more enduring than the material surface it produces. Every tradition describes an informational ground that is comprehensive, containing the total information content of all possible realities. Every tradition describes the act of creation as an informational act, a speech, a thought, a command, a projection, a disclosure, a computation. And every tradition describes the informational ground as conscious, as aware, as knowing, as the kind of entity that processes information not mechanically but with intention, purpose, and creative intelligence. 6 structural features, present in every tradition, independently developed, across every continent, across every century, and now, for the first time in history, mirrored in mathematical form, with experimental confirmation by the physics of information, the holographic principle, and the emergence of space-time from quantum entanglement. The final part of this investigation will put it all together, the physics, the traditions, the implications, and confront the question that this entire investigation has been building toward. If reality is made of information rather than matter, then what are you? And what does it mean for how you live, how you die, and what you are? 3 investigations, 3 independent approaches to the deepest question physics has ever asked. What is reality made of? And the answer from the quantum mechanics, from the theoretical physics, from every major contemplative tradition in human history, is not what anyone expected. Reality is not made of matter. It is not made of energy. It is not made of particles, or fields, or forces, or space-time. Reality is made of information. Matter is information structured. Energy is information in motion. Space-time is information organized. And consciousness, the one thing in the universe that directly experiences information, may be the most fundamental feature of reality, not the most derivative. The physics established the hierarchy. Wheeler demonstrated that every particle, every force field, every feature of the physical world derives its existence from information, it from bit. Zeilinger earned the Nobel Prize, confirming that the fundamental unit of physics is the qubit quantum information, and that particles do not have definite properties until information about those properties is created through measurement. The quantum eraser demonstrated that information determines reality retroactively, that the existence or non-existence of information about a particle's path determines the particle's behavior, even after the behavior has already been recorded. Entanglement demonstrated that information transcends space, that informational correlations persist across any distance, instantaneously, without any physical signal. The black hole information paradox demonstrated that information is indestructible, that not even the most extreme physical process in the universe can destroy a single bit of information. The holographic principle demonstrated that three-dimensional reality is a projection from a two-dimensional informational surface, that the world is a hologram, that depth is emergent, that the boundary is the reality and the bulk is the image. And the emergence of space-time from entanglement demonstrated that space and time themselves, the stage on which all physical events occur, are not fundamental but are produced by informational correlations, by entanglement, by the relational structure of quantum information. The traditions provided the map. Christianity places the logos, the word, the rational structure, the divine information at the origin of creation, prior to matter, prior to energy, prior to space-time. The logos is God. Through the logos, all things were made. Hinduism places consciousness, chit, at the foundation of reality, describing the material world as Maya, a projection from the conscious ground of Brahman, sustained by the informational pulsation of Spanda. Buddhism identifies the relational structure of dependent origination pratitya samutpada as the fundamental reality, describing material objects as empty of intrinsic existence, and identifying the informational web of relationships as more real than the nodes it connects. Islam places the divine command kun, be at the origin of creation, describing the material world as the output of a divine speech act, with every event recorded in the preserved tablet of cosmic information. Taoism identifies the Tao, the way, the principle, the informational pattern as the source from which all things emerge. And Kabbalah describes creation as a progressive informational cascade from the infinite Ein Sof through the 10 Sephirot to the material world of Malkut, a holographic projection from the informational source to the physical surface. 6 traditions, 6 vocabularies, 1 structure. Information precedes matter. The code generates the cosmos. The word creates the world. Now let us confront the objections with the seriousness they deserve. The first objection is the semantic objection. Information in physics does not mean the same thing as information in everyday language. In physics, information is a technical term. It refers to the number of possible states a system can occupy, to the entropy of a system, to the distinguishability of quantum states. It does not mean meaning, it does not mean knowledge, it does not mean message. The physicist who says the universe is made of information is not saying the same thing as the mystic who says in the beginning was the word. The physicist is making a technical claim about the mathematical structure of quantum mechanics. The mystic is making a theological claim about the origin and nature of reality. Equating the two is a category error, a confusion of technical vocabulary with ordinary language that produces an illusion of convergence where no genuine convergence exists. This objection is serious and must be addressed carefully. The physicist's information is indeed a technical term defined by Shannon's information theory as the reduction of uncertainty, measured in bits, quantified by entropy. It does not inherently carry meaning, purpose, or intelligence. A random string of ones and zeros contains maximum information in the Shannon sense, but minimum meaning in the human sense. The tradition's logos or word or consciousness does carry meaning, purpose, and intelligence. It is not merely a measure of possible states, but a creative principle that acts with intention. The distinction is real, but the convergence is also real, and it is deeper than the semantic difference. Both the physics and the traditions agree on the structural claim. Information is prior to matter. Both agree that the material world is not self-explanatory, that it requires something non-material to account for its existence and its structure. Both agree that the non-material something has the properties of information pattern, structure, correlation, the capacity to generate specific outcomes from general possibilities. The physics adds precision, mathematical formalism, experimental confirmation, quantitative predictions. The traditions add depth, meaning, purpose, consciousness. The claim that the informational ground is not merely a mathematical structure but a living awareness that creates with intention. Max Tegmark, the MIT physicist whose mathematical universe hypothesis we encountered in the first part of this investigation, has argued that the convergence between the physics and the traditions may be more than complementary. Tegmark proposes that the universe is not merely described by mathematics, it is mathematics. Mathematical structures do not exist because the universe exists. The universe exists because mathematical structures exist. And mathematical structures are informational, they are patterns, relationships, logical dependencies, abstract configurations that have the properties of information rather than the properties of matter. If Tegmark is right, then the ground of reality that the traditions describe as conscious as the Logos, as Brahman, as the mind of God may be a mathematical informational structure that has the property of self-awareness. Not because someone designed it to be self-aware, because self-awareness is what mathematical structures of sufficient complexity naturally produce. The hard problem of consciousness may be solved not by explaining how matter produces awareness, but by recognizing that awareness is a fundamental feature of informational structures, as fundamental as the mathematical relationships themselves. This is speculative, but it is the direction in which both the physics and the traditions point. The two are not identical, but they are complementary, and the structural alignment between them, the fact that both, independently, place information at the foundation of reality is not a category error, it is a convergence that demands investigation. The second objection is the interpretation objection. The holographic principle has been confirmed mathematically within the specific framework of ADS. CFT correspondence, a correspondence between a 5-dimensional anti-de Sitter space and a 4-dimensional conformal field theory. But our universe is not an anti-de Sitter space. Our universe has a positive cosmological constant. It is a de Sitter space, and the ADS-CFT correspondence does not directly apply. The extrapolation from ADS-CFT to claims about our actual universe is a leap that the mathematics does not strictly justify. This objection is technically valid. The holographic principle has not been proven for our specific universe. The ADS-CFT correspondence is a mathematical tool, not a direct description of the cosmos we inhabit, and the extension of holographic ideas from the theoretical framework in which they were proven to the physical universe in which we live involves assumptions that have not been verified. The honest position is, the holographic principle is established mathematics within a specific theoretical framework. Its application to our universe is a hypothesis well motivated, widely accepted among theoretical physicists, but not experimentally confirmed. The information first picture is strongly suggested by the evidence. It is not proven beyond doubt, but the hypothesis is not arbitrary. The Bekenstein bound applies to any region of space, not just anti-de Sitter space. The black hole information paradox and its resolution through unitarity apply to any quantum system, not just the specific system described by ADS, CFT. The emergence of spacetime from entanglement has been demonstrated in multiple theoretical frameworks, not just ADS, CFT, and the convergence between the theoretical result and the experimental evidence, the quantum eraser, the Bell violations. The information conservation provides a body of support that extends well beyond the specific mathematical framework in which the holographic principle was first proven. The third objection is the consciousness objection. The traditions do not merely claim that information precedes matter. They claim that conscious information precedes matter, that the informational ground is aware, intentional, creative, and intelligent. Physics makes no such claim. Physics describes information as a mathematical quantity, not as a conscious agent. The tradition's logos is conscious. The tradition's Brahman is conscious. The tradition's kun is the speech act of a conscious God. But the physicist's information is not conscious. The physicist's qubits do not think. The physicist's holographic boundary does not intend. The gap between the universe is made of information and the universe is made of conscious information is not bridged by the physics and the tradition's claim that the informational ground is conscious. Remains a theological assertion, not a scientific conclusion. This objection identifies the genuine boundary between what the physics establishes and what the traditions claim. The physics establishes that information is fundamental. The physics does not establish that information is conscious. The gap is real, but the gap is not as wide as it appears because the physics also cannot explain consciousness within the materialist framework. The hard problem of consciousness, the question of why physical processes produce subjective experience, remains unsolved. If matter is fundamental, consciousness is inexplicable because there is no known mechanism by which material processes produce the subjective quality of experience. If information is fundamental, consciousness may be less inexplicable because information and consciousness share a deep structural feature. Both are relational, both involve the organization of states, both depend on the distinction between possibilities, and both transcend the spatial limitations that characterize material objects. The traditions claim that the informational ground is conscious may or may not be correct, but it is not refuted by the physics, and it is at least coherent with the physics in a way that the materialist claim that consciousness is produced by unconscious matter is not. The hard problem of consciousness is hard because matter is the wrong starting point. Information may be the right one. John Wheeler himself suggested this possibility late in his career with the concept of the participatory universe, the idea that the universe does not exist independently of observation, that the observer participates in the creation of the reality that the observer observes, and that the universe is not a machine that runs on its own, but a participatory process that requires consciousness to become definite. Wheeler drew a diagram of a cosmic eye, the universe looking at itself, observing itself into existence, creating the information that constitutes its own reality through the act of conscious observation. The participatory universe is an information-first universe that is also a consciousness-first universe because information, in the quantum sense, is created by observation. An observation requires an observer, and the observer is conscious. And if information is the right starting point for understanding reality, then the traditions claim that information is conscious, that the ground of reality is aware, may be not a primitive anthropomorphism, but a profound insight into the nature of the informational ground that physics is only beginning to explore. Now, let us trace the connections to every investigation we have conducted. The observer effect is the quantum expression of information precedence. Every observation creates information. Every creation of information determines reality. The observer does not merely watch reality unfold. The observer participates in reality's creation by generating the information that makes reality definite. Without the observer, reality remains indefinite. A superposition of possibilities, a wave function of potentials, an information-free state that has no definite properties. With the observer, reality becomes specific, a collapsed state, a definite outcome, an information-rich actuality. The observer is the information generator, and the information the observer generates is the substance from which reality is constructed. The heart investigation revealed that the heart processes information independently of the brain and broadcasts information through its electromagnetic field to every cell in the body and to nearby individuals. The heart is an information organ. Its coherence or incoherence is an informational state, and the quality of that informational state, coherent or incoherent, ordered or disordered, determines the quality of the brain's processing, the body's physiology, and the electromagnetic environment of everyone in the vicinity. You are not merely made of information. You are broadcasting information continuously, involuntarily, through the electromagnetic field of the heart that the HeartMath research has measured and characterized. The placebo investigation demonstrated that information creates biology. The patient receives information: a sugar pill, a saline injection, a doctor's confident pronouncement, and the information produces specific, measurable, clinically significant biological changes. Endorphins from expectation, dopamine from belief, gene expression changes from meditation. The information does not merely describe the biology, it creates the biology. The information is prior, the biology is the output. The free will investigation demonstrated that consciousness selects information, choosing which quantum template to attend to, which possibility to collapse, which actuality to bring into existence from the field of potentials. Free will is information selection, and the selection is consequential. It determines which neural template is stabilized, which behavior is expressed, which karma is created. The free agent is an information processor, but not a mechanical one, a conscious one, an intentional one. An agent whose selections are not determined by prior states but are genuine creations of new information in the universe. The fear investigation demonstrated that information patterns can trap consciousness. Chronic fear is a self-reinforcing information loop. The fearful expectation generates the information that confirms the fear, which generates more fearful expectation, which generates more confirming information. The Zeno effect stabilizes the fear pattern. The repeated observation of the feared outcome prevents the information state from evolving into a different pattern. Fear is an information trap, and liberation from fear is an information update, a change in the pattern, a disruption of the loop, a conscious introduction of new information that breaks the Zeno stabilization and allows the information state to evolve. The subconscious investigation revealed that the vast majority of information processing occurs below the threshold of consciousness in the 95% of cognitive activity that Zoltman identified as unconscious. The unconscious mind is an information processor of extraordinary power and sophistication, processing millions of bits per second, integrating sensory data, generating somatic markers, producing the templates from which conscious awareness selects. And the information processed by the unconscious may include non-local information, pre-stimulus data, archetypal patterns, intuitive knowledge that arrives from beyond the sensory apparatus. The unconscious mind is the brain's interface with the implicate order, the channel through which the cosmic information field feeds data into the individual nervous system. The karma investigation demonstrated that information is conserved, that every intentional action deposits an informational trace that persists in the quantum field, shapes future probabilities, and transmits across generations through epigenetic mechanisms. Karma is information preservation. The karmic record is the universe's memory, the total information content of all intentional actions stored in the neural pathways, the somatic markers, the epigenome, and the quantum vacuum. And the conservation of karma, the principle that no karmic seed is ever lost, is the biological expression of the unitarity of quantum mechanics. Information cannot be destroyed. The synchronicity investigation revealed that meaningful coincidences, causal correlations between inner states and outer events, are informational phenomena. A synchronistic event is not a causal event. It is not produced by a physical force transmitting energy from one location to another. It is an informational correlation, a meaningful relationship between two events that are causally unrelated but informationally connected. In the implicate order, every event is enfolded into every other event. Every event contains information about every other event. Synchronicity is the perception of this informational connection, the moment when consciousness becomes aware of the correlation between its inner state and an outer event that is informationally, but not causally, related. If reality is made of information, then synchronicity is not mysterious. It is inevitable because in an informational universe, everything is connected to everything else through the informational web, and the connections are not spatial or causal, but structural and informational. The distance and time investigations extended the information picture across the dimensions that physics describes and that the traditions transcend. If distance is an informational illusion, if the three-dimensional bulk is a holographic projection from a two-dimensional boundary, then spatial separation is not a fundamental feature of reality. It is a feature of the projection. In the informational ground on the boundary, in the implicate order, there is no distance. Everything is informationally connected to everything else, and the non-locality that entanglement demonstrates is not a strange exception to the rule of spatial separation. It is the informational ground showing through the holographic projection the boundary reality, asserting itself against the bulk illusion. If time is an informational illusion, if the block universe is real, if the Wheeler-DeWitt equation describes a timeless quantum state from which the perception of temporal flow emerges as an informational construct, then the arrow of time is not a fundamental feature of reality. It is a feature of the informational processing that consciousness performs. The quantum eraser's retroactive determination of reality is not a violation of the temporal order. It is a glimpse of the informational ground in which temporal order does not exist, in which all moments coexist as features of a single informational structure, and the perception of sequence is a construct of the consciousness that navigates the structure. The music investigation revealed that organized information, the mathematical relationships between frequencies, the harmonic series, the rhythmic patterns produces specific effects on the brain and body that disorganized information does not. Music is organized information, and the organization matters not merely aesthetically but physiologically. Consonance produces cardiac coherence, dissonance produces cardiac incoherence, rhythm entrains neural oscillations, harmony activates the reward system. The body responds not to the physical properties of sound, not to the amplitude, not to the raw energy, but to the informational structure of the sound. The pattern matters more than the power. The information matters more than the medium. This is the information first principle expressed in the domain of human experience. The OBE investigation demonstrated that consciousness may not be confined to the body, that the informational content of consciousness may persist when the brain's activity ceases, that the quantum information in the microtubules may dissipate into the vacuum rather than disappearing, and that the near-death experience may be the subjective experience of consciousness transitioning from a localized informational state to a non-localized one. If consciousness is information and if information is conserved, then consciousness is conserved. The body dies, the information persists, and the soul that the traditions describe, the non-material essence that survives the death of the body, may be the informational pattern of consciousness, preserved by the unitarity of quantum mechanics, distributed into the non-local quantum field, and potentially capable of relocalizing in a new physical substrate. The evolution investigation revealed that evolution itself may be an informational process, a quantum search algorithm that explores the space of possible biological forms and selects the forms that are informationally coherent with the environment. Mutation is the generation of new information. Selection is the evaluation of that information against environmental criteria. Adaptation is the accumulation of informationally successful patterns. And the genetic code, the DNA sequence that encodes the blueprint of every living organism, is literally a code. It is information written in a four-letter alphabet, A, T, G, C, stored in a molecular medium, read by a cellular machinery that translates the informational content into biological structures. Life does not merely use information. Life is information. The genome is a database. Development is a computation. And evolution is a 4 billion year information processing project that has produced the most informationally complex structures in the known universe. Human brains, with their 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synaptic connections, each one an informational channel carrying the data from which consciousness emerges. The Dark Forest investigation explored the question of why the universe appears empty of other civilizations, and the information picture adds a dimension to this question. If the universe is fundamentally informational, then the development of intelligence, of information processing systems sophisticated enough to recognize the informational nature of reality, may be the universe's purpose. Not in the teleological sense of a designer who planned it, in the informational sense of a system that naturally evolves toward greater informational complexity, greater self-knowledge, greater awareness of its own structure. The universe produces stars that produce heavy elements, that produce planets, that produce life, that produces brains, that produce consciousness, that discovers that the universe is made of information. The universe is a code that writes decoders. It is information that produces information processors. It is a message that generates readers. And the development of consciousness, the moment when the information becomes aware of itself, may be not an accident, but an inevitability of informational systems of sufficient complexity. The CERN, hidden layer, investigation, and the neural network investigation explored the parallels between the universe's structure and the structure of information processing systems, finding that the mathematical architecture of neural networks, deep learning algorithms, and the universe's own physical laws share structural features that are consistent with the information. First picture: the universe is not merely described by information. It is structured like an information processing system, with layers, with feedback loops, with error correction, with a kind of organized complexity that characterizes designed computational architectures. Every thread connects. Every investigation points to the same conclusion. Information is fundamental. Matter is derived. The code generates the cosmos, and consciousness, the one thing in the universe that directly knows, processes, and creates information maybe not the byproduct of a material universe, but the very thing from which the material universe is made. The practical implications of the information first picture are not abstract, they are immediate and personal, and they connect to every practice that the traditions prescribe and every finding that the neuroscience confirms. The first implication is that attention is the most powerful force in your life. If information determines reality, if what you observe is what becomes real, then what you pay attention to is what you are creating. Attention is not passive, it is creative. It generates the information that collapses the wave function, that stabilizes the quantum pattern, that deposits the karmic trace. The Zeno effect demonstrates this. Sustained attention stabilizes the attended state. Fear stabilizes fear. Love stabilizes love. And the choice of where to direct your attention, the process one choice that Stapp identified as the quantum interface between consciousness and the brain, is the most consequential choice you make in every moment of your life. The traditions know this. Where your attention goes, your energy flows, is not a self-help slogan. It is a description of the quantum Zeno effect applied to human consciousness. The second implication is that the quality of your inner life matters as much as the quality of your outer life. If you are made of information, then the information you generate internally through thought, intention, emotion, meditation, prayer is as real and as consequential as the information you encounter externally. The HeartMath research demonstrates that the heart's electromagnetic field changes measurably in response to internal states, that the information generated by your emotions is broadcast through your body and beyond your body to every person in your vicinity. Your inner life is not private. It is electromagnetic. It is informational. It is physically real and physically consequential. The third implication is that death may not be what you think it is. If you are made of information rather than matter, then what you think matters more than what you eat. What you intend matters more than what you possess. What you attend to matters more than where you are. The quality of your information, the coherence of your thoughts, the clarity of your intentions, the depth of your awareness determines the quality of your reality, not metaphorically, physically, because information is physical, and you, the conscious, information processing, reality creating being that is reading these words, are the point at which the cosmic information field becomes aware of itself. Every tradition says the same thing in different words. You are not a body that has a soul. You are a soul that has a body. You are not matter that produces consciousness. You are consciousness that projects matter. You are not an accident of physics. You are the purpose of physics, the point at which information becomes aware, the moment at which the code reads itself, the instant at which the Logos looks into the mirror of creation and recognizes its own face. The physics does not prove this. The traditions assert it, and the convergence between them, the structural alignment between what the equations describe and what the contemplatives experience, is the most remarkable intellectual event of our time. Two independent methods of investigating reality, mathematical physics and contemplative practice, conducted by communities that had no contact with each other, using tools that have nothing in common, arriving at the same conclusion: information is the ground, matter is the surface, and consciousness, the awareness that processes information, that creates meaning from data, that asks questions about its own nature, is the deepest feature of reality, not the shallowest. The third implication connects to everything we discovered in the OBE investigation. If consciousness is information, and information is conserved, then consciousness is conserved. The unitarity of quantum mechanics guarantees that no information is destroyed, not even by a black hole, not even by the death of the brain. The pattern of information that constitutes your conscious experience does not disappear when the brain stops functioning. It transforms. It redistributes. It may dissipate into the quantum vacuum, into the implicate order, into the non-local informational ground from which it originally emerged. Death, in the information first picture, is not the annihilation of consciousness. It is the delocalization of consciousness, the transition from a concentrated, body-centered informational pattern to a distributed, non-local informational state. The traditions call this transition the departure of the soul. The physics calls it the dispersal of quantum information. The name does not matter, and the implications for the tradition's claims about the afterlife, about reincarnation, about the persistence of individual identity beyond death, become, for the first time in the history of science, physically possible rather than physically impossible. Not proven, not confirmed, but possible, because information is conserved, because patterns persist, because the code endures even when the hardware fails. The Buddhist traditions claim that consciousness transmigrates through the bardo states between death and rebirth, carrying karmic information from one life to the next, is not refuted by information physics. It is permitted by it. The Hindu traditions claim that the Atman, the essential self, the informational core of identity, survives the death of the body and continues through the cycle of samsara until liberation, is not refuted by information physics. It is permitted by it. The Christian traditions claim that the soul survives death, carrying the informational content of a life lived, is not refuted by information physics. It is permitted by it. The physics does not confirm these claims. But for the first time, the physics does not prohibit them. What matters is the conservation, the mathematical guarantee that the information is preserved, that the pattern persists, that the code endures. You are not what you think you are. You are not a collection of atoms, assembled by chance, animated by chemistry, and destined to dissolve into the void. You are a pattern of information, woven from the same code that structures galaxies and composes symphonies and writes the laws of physics. You are a pattern that the universe is using to know itself. A pattern that has been running for the entirety of your life, maintaining its coherence while the physical substrate changes completely beneath it. Every 7 to 10 years, virtually every atom in your body is replaced. The carbon in your muscles, the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the phosphorus in your DNA, all of it cycles in and out, replaced by new atoms from the food you eat, the water you drink, the air you breathe. The atoms you were made of 10 years ago are now dispersed across the planet in other people's bodies, in the soil, in the ocean, in the atmosphere. And yet, you persist. You are the same person you were 10 years ago, the same memories, the same personality, the same sense of continuous identity, despite the fact that not a single atom remains from the person you were then. This is the deepest proof of the information first picture, and it is not theoretical. It is personal. It is happening in your body right now. You are not your atoms. Your atoms are temporary residents, passing through the pattern of you on their way to somewhere else. You are the pattern. You are the information. You are the code that persists while the medium changes, the message that endures while the molecules cycle, the form that maintains itself, while the matter flows through it like water through a riverbed. The river is not the water. The river is the pattern the water makes. And you are not the atoms. You are the pattern the atoms make. And the pattern the information is what is real. A pattern that persists when the atoms change, because the atoms have been changing your entire life. Every cell replaced, every molecule recycled, and yet you remain. You remain because you are not the atoms. You are the pattern. You are the information. You are the code. And the code, if the physics and the traditions are both pointing in the right direction, was here before the atoms, will be here after the atoms, and is, in some sense, that neither physics nor theology can yet fully articulate the reason the atoms exist at all. In the beginning was the information, and the information became the world, and the world became aware, and here you are.